I had just dropped my in-laws off at the airport and was halfway back to my army base when our housekeeper of 10 years called me. Maria never called during work hours, never. When I answered, all I heard at first was her breathing. Then came the words that made my hands tighten around the steering wheel. Don't go home. Check your security cameras. The line went dead. A cold weight settled in my chest as I pulled into a gas station parking lot and opened the security app on my phone. The first camera loaded slowly, frame by frame. My living room appeared. Then my front door opened. My mother-in-law stepped inside carrying the spare key I had trusted her with for years. Behind her walked my father-in-law. And then my husband, not surprised, not confused, waiting. I switched to the kitchen camera. Cabinets opened. Drawers emptied. My safe room door unlocked. My father-in-law held up a folder and smiled while my husband pointed toward the document cabinet where I kept military records, financial files, and the papers for the house I had inherited before our marriage. Maria's frightened voice echoed in my mind. This wasn't a visit. This was a search. And judging by how carefully they avoided the cameras, they thought were disconnected. They believed I would never see any of it. They were wrong. For the first time in my military career, the battlefield waiting for me wasn't overseas. It was my own home. My name is Captain Elena Carter, and for most of my adult life, I believed loyalty was something you earned by giving it first. The Army had taught me discipline, patience, and preparation. My family had taught me something very different. I met my husband, Daniel, 12 years earlier while I was stationed in Texas. He was charming in the effortless way some people are, quick smiles, easy promises, and a talent for making everyone around him feel important, especially me. Back then, I mistook being needed for being loved. Daniel worked in real estate on and off, but my military career provided the stability in our marriage. The house we lived in wasn't ours. It was mine. I inherited it from my grandmother 3 years before I met him, long before wedding vows and shared bank accounts complicated ownership. His parents never liked that fact. They never said it directly, of course. People like Richard and Susan preferred polished comments that sounded harmless, until you listened closely. It's wonderful that Daniel doesn't mind living in your house. Military pensions are such a blessing for young couples. Some men would struggle with that arrangement. Always smiling. Always careful. Always reminding everyone in the room whose name wasn't on the deed. For years, I ignored it. Military deployments have a way of teaching you to save your energy for battles that matter. So I stayed quiet when Susan rearranged furniture without asking during visits. I stayed quiet when Richard referred to my deployments as extended business trips. I stayed quiet when Daniel laughed instead of defending me. The silence became a habit, an expectation. Somewhere along the way, they confused my restraint with weakness. They saw the uniforms, medals, and rank, but missed the person wearing them. To them, I was predictable. Reliable, the woman who paid the bills, organized holidays, and solved problems while everyone else took credit for the peace. Maria noticed it long before I did. She once told me, while folding towels in the laundry room, that the kindest people are often treated like permanent furniture. Useful, dependable, invisible. Watching my in-laws move confidently through rooms they believed belonged to them, I realized something uncomfortable. They weren't acting like guests in my home. They were acting like heirs. And that meant they believed the future had already been decided without me. The footage on my phone didn't create the problem. It only removed the last excuse I had left. For years, the disrespect had arrived in small enough pieces to explain away. A comment here. A smile there. A pause that lasted half a second too long. The kind of things that sound harmless when repeated out loud but leave a bruise all the same. Susan had a habit of walking through my house with the quiet confidence of an owner conducting inspections. She would run her fingers across shelves and window frames before offering observations, disguised as concern. Military schedules don't leave much time for proper housekeeping. Maria would lower her eyes and continue dusting, while I smiled politely and changed the subject. Richard preferred numbers. He liked asking about deployment bonuses, retirement benefits, and housing allowances with the casual curiosity of a man discussing the weather. Must be nice having such security. Daniel says the military benefits cover most things. Not questions. Inventory, Daniel never seemed to notice. Or perhaps noticing would have required choosing a side. During family dinners, conversations had a strange gravity to them. My promotions were acknowledged briefly before attention drifted elsewhere. Daniel's unfinished projects somehow became the real topic of celebration. When I made major, Susan raised her glass and smiled. "You've always been such a hard worker." Then she turned toward Daniel. "And you've been so supportive of her career." As if I had climbed every rung while standing on his shoulders. The room nodded. I remember the soft clink of silverware against plates, the quiet hum of the air conditioner, the feeling of becoming invisible while sitting at my own table. The worst part wasn't the insults. It was the certainty behind them. They spoke as though my time in my own home was temporary. Susan would say things like, "One day we'll finally renovate this kitchen properly." "Not you will. We will." At the time, I thought she was being presumptuous. My phone, a secure cloud account, and an external military-grade encrypted drive I used for sensitive records. Then I made 2 calls. The first was to my attorney, who had handled my grandmother's estate years earlier and knew the history of the property better than anyone. The second was to the locksmith, who serviced the base housing office and owed me a favor from a deployment fundraiser years before. By the time I finally started the engine, replacement locks had been scheduled for the following morning. Access codes would be changed before sunset. I still hadn't decided what I would say to Daniel, but I knew exactly what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't argue, and I certainly wouldn't warn them. People reveal the most about themselves when they believe nobody is watching. So I decided to let them keep believing exactly that, for one more night. I arrived home just after sunset. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone as if it had been an ordinary afternoon. Susan was making tea. Richard stood by the window with his hands in his pockets. 3 people performing normalcy. 3 terrible actors. Daniel looked up first. "You're back earlier than expected." I set my bag down beside the door. "So I've heard." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then I placed 3 printed photographs on the counter. One showed Richard opening my office cabinet. The second showed Susan photographing documents. The third showed Daniel holding my house deed in both hands. The room became very still. Susan's face lost color first. Richard stared at the pictures without touching them. Daniel looked at me, then at the photographs, then back at me. "You were watching?" "No," I replied calmly. My security system was. The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting ever could. Daniel started explaining immediately. Misunderstanding. Curiosity. Bad timing. Words rushed into the room searching for somewhere to land. None of them did. I simply slid another folder across the counter. Inside were copies of the property records, legal documents, and a letter from my attorney confirming what had always been true. The house belonged solely to me. It always had. It always would. Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair. Susan looked toward Daniel for answers he clearly didn't have. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. "The locks are being changed tomorrow morning." Nobody argued. Nobody even tried. Because for the first time, they understood that this conversation was not a negotiation. I wasn't removing them from my life out of anger. I was removing their access to it. Outside, the porch light flickered on as evening settled over the street. Inside, the illusion they had spent years building quietly came apart. Not with shouting, not with revenge speeches, just with evidence. Sometimes the loudest sound in a room is the moment people realize they have lost control of the story they were writing about you. The next morning, the locksmith arrived at 7:30. By 8, every exterior lock had been replaced. By 8:15, every access code, garage remote, and alarm credential connected to the house existed only in my possession. Control doesn't always leave with drama. Sometimes it leaves with a quiet click. Daniel watched the locksmith work from the dining room window without saying much. For the first time since I had known him, he looked less like a husband defending his choices and more like a man realizing those choices had consequences. His parents left before noon. Susan paused beside the front door as though waiting for someone to stop her. No one did. Richard carried their luggage to the car, without his usual commentary about property values or renovations. The silence seemed unfamiliar to him, as if he had spent so many years assuming access was permanent, that he had never prepared for the possibility of losing it. Daniel stayed behind. For several days, he tried to explain intentions instead of actions. He insisted they were only looking, only checking paperwork, only trying to help. But trust has a strange relationship with the word only. A person rarely uses it until something important has already been broken. Eventually, our conversation shifted from apologies to logistics. Lawyers, documents, timelines. Not because I hated him, because some decisions survive disappointment, while others don't survive betrayal. The harder lesson was realizing how much of my own worth I had quietly handed over to other people's approval. I had spent years earning respect from people who benefited from withholding it. Many people do. Families, workplaces, friendships. Sometimes the role assigned to the reliable person is simple. Carry the weight, stay quiet, be grateful, until the day they stop carrying it. That was the part of the story that mattered most. Not the cameras, not the locks, not even the house. The real cost of being underestimated isn't what people take from you. It's how long it can take to notice they're taking it at all. 3 months later, the house felt different. Not bigger, not quieter, just honest. There were no unexpected opinions drifting in from the kitchen. No comments disguised as concern. No invisible negotiations taking place around my own life. For the first time in years, every key that opened the front door belonged to someone I trusted, including me. Daniel and I finalized the divorce 6 months later. It wasn't dramatic. No courtroom speeches. No last-minute apologies. Just signatures, paperwork, and 2 people acknowledging that trust, once broken in certain ways, does not return in its original shape. Maria stayed. Sometimes we shared coffee on the back patio before my morning runs, watching the sunrise over the garden my grandmother had planted decades earlier. One morning she asked if I regretted any of it. I thought about the question for a long time. I regretted the years I spent mistaking silence for peace. I regretted believing that keeping everyone comfortable was the same thing as keeping a family together. But I didn't regret the decision itself. Not for a second. The Army eventually transferred me to a leadership position where younger officers often came to me for advice. Surprisingly, very little of it involved strategy or operations. Most of it involved boundaries, respect, the quiet art of recognizing your own value before someone else decides it for you. Because the truth is, betrayal rarely begins with one large act. It begins with small permissions. One dismissed comment, one ignored instinct, one compromise too many. And recovery begins the same way. One decision, one boundary, one locked door. My grandmother used to say that a house remembers the people who protect it. Some evenings, when the last light settles across the living room floor and the rooms fall silent around me, I think she may have been right. Because the house no longer feels like something I inherited. It feels like something I defended. And sometimes the most powerful victory isn't taking anything back. It's simply refusing to surrender it ever again.